Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Now, nearly 50 leaders are gathering in Yerevan, Armenia, on Monday for the 8th European Political Community Summit. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk also in attendance. Now, established following a Russian invasion of Ukraine, the forum promotes dialogue and cooperation. The summit will focus on security, energy, and Ukraine. Now, joined there for the first time also by Canada. Now, the capital of Armenia will also play host to the first ever EU-Armenia summit set to take place over the next 2 days. Now, to analyze the latest, what it all means, we're joined by Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Studies Center. Good to have you with us. Welcome back.
Thank you, Sascha.
So it's a big day for the region, a big day for Armenia, but let's just go into the significance of this summit. Many leaders there from not just Europe, but also further afield. Tell us the significance of what the summit means, what tangibles can come out of this, and what it also means for Yerevan.
Well, in general, I think there are two specific demonstrations of the significance of this summit. First, for Armenia itself, this is very much a reward, a recognition by the West and by the European political community of the progress Armenia has posted in difficult diplomacy with its neighbors, Azerbaijan and Turkey. At the same time, for the EU, it's also a significant demonstration of European commitment to democracy and stabilizing the former Soviet space. In other words, Armenia is still a country that hosts a Russian military base. This is rather unprecedented and quite significant in that context.
And also, I think what's interesting here is just the manner of all these leaders who are here. Now, European ones as well as further afield. Now, Canada here for the first time. Tell us briefly on why that matters so much as well these days.
Well, that's a very good question, because the Canadian Prime Minister's visit to Armenia follows the previous Prime Minister Trudeau's arrival in Armenia. Canada and Armenia have been deepening ties for a number of years. However, the importance of the Canadian presence is also a demonstration that Armenia has a much elevated strategic significance well beyond the region.
There's also going to be a whole host of bilateral meetings as well. President Zelensky is there. Just tell us, if you can, in your mind, what do you think likely discussion points? I mean, Poland is also there meeting with Zelensky, with the UK, other leaders as well. What does this, let's say, what will come out of this on when these leaders meet privately?
Well, to be realistic, Armenia is hosting the European Political Community Summit. In other words, not everything is about Armenia. The Ukrainian president, with his bilateral agenda, is also focused on the need for greater defense and military support for Ukraine, especially given the unpredictability from the United States. However, at the same time, we also see Armenia benefiting from the presence of the Turkish vice president. There's even a plan for a remote online participation by the Azerbaijani president. So Armenia is only a host, yet is able to garner much greater diplomatic dividends from this summit. And some of those dividends also, I mean, the EPC, that's one element that's happening today, and over those, it coincides with that, as I mentioned in the beginning, that EU-Armenia summit, that first of its kind. So tell us, I mean, you already alluded to it, Armenia's changing role. Does this now lock Armenia really steadfastly into that EU, that European orbit, or is it still trying to play also both sides into Russia? I know that we talked about this in the past. Where's the direction of Armenia with all this? Well, that's a very good question without a very good answer. In other words, what we see is an Armenia-EU bilateral summit scheduled for tomorrow that is more about Armenia's deepening of its relationship with the EU short of membership. And going forward, Armenia is still a member of the Russian-dominated Eurasian Economic Union, which precludes EU membership. So I do think for Armenia, they're trying to play a weak hand better, trying to diversify partners as much as possible, short of abandoning the Russian orbit completely and short of pivoting totally to the West. For that, I think it's a more prudent and realistic assessment of the weakness of Armenia and the lack of leverage. Nevertheless, we do see this Armenia-EU summit as an affirmation of both democratic credentials in Armenia and also the need to reassert independence despite Russia.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, let's also talk about timing for a moment. It's always critical to speak to all these partners, but timing-wise for Armenia, for the Prime Minister, Sobchanian, it looks also like there's about a month or so or less before elections. How will this impact all of this going forward?
The domestic political impact is already noticeable. In other words, for any incumbent government, this kind of high-level legitimacy is a welcome injection of political momentum. For the Armenian government as well, they will be able to leverage this, especially in terms of Armenia's post-war difficulty in the sense of Russia's betrayal and the sense of conflict and loss. So I do think it helps the Armenian government's message of moving to peace and making renewed conflict much less likely.
So in all of this, I mean, we still have some days ahead before we get the concrete details, but just give us your sense. What would success look like for Yerevan? Is it the same success for the EU at the end of these next few days?
Well, I would argue success has already been achieved. The actual arrival of these world leaders in Armenia in and of itself was an important symbolic success. For the EU, the launch of this summit in Armenia itself is an important demonstration of EU engagement, which is now much more realistic and actually much more sustainable. So I do think this really ends the discrepancy between EU ambition and aspiration versus real action on the ground. For the first time, there is a match between aspirations and slogans and EU engagement within Armenia itself.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, it's also the moment which matters. We're just hearing as well that the UK, which is also in attendance there, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, has also announced the UK will likely step in and also be part of this 90 billion euro loan that the EU has then finally agreed to go and give to Ukraine. So how significant is that, and the UK stepping in on that? I mean, what's that do with relations? I know it's a bit further afield, but give us your take on that.
Well, I think it's very significant for a broader reason. The absence of the United States, not just from this summit, but the absence of the U.S. from overall Western security architecture. The UK, even after the British King's recent visit to Washington and his message, is that recovering from Brexit is also dealing with a difficult U.S. partnership. And I do think the UK now is returning much more to European security and much less reliance on the special relationship with the US.
Mm-hmm. And also, just to kind of bring it home as well, if we're looking at the public in Armenia, and we know over the last years and months, we've seen next door in Georgia, very much a lot of pro-European sentiment. People feel like they want to be part of Europe. What do ordinary Armenians think? I mean, it's obviously a major summit. Well, what do they want ultimately in all this?
Well, on the one hand, we see no real contest. European engagement in Armenia is based on seduction, attraction. Russian engagement has long been based on the negative, coercion, pressure. There's really no contest. On the other hand, I do think there are realistic expectations, realistic in terms of what the EU can and cannot do or deliver. This is much more about Armenia's self-sufficiency, the importance of democratic governance, the need for Armenia to reassert its independence especially in this post-conflict region.
Yeah, so there's going to be a plethora of topics with some top names there in Yerevan over the next few days. We'll analyze it further. But look, thanks for setting the groundwork there for us. Always a pleasure having you. Richard Giragosian there from the Regional Studies Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks. But stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.